On the morning of September 2, 1945, the prediction came true. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been dead for over 2 years by then, shot down over the Solomon Islands by American fighters who had intercepted his flight plans. But as Japanese officials stood aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, watching General Douglas MacArthur accept their nation's surrender, they witnessed something Yamamoto had warned about since 1940. They witnessed American firepower. Surrounding the Missouri that morning was one of the most powerful concentrations of naval strength ever assembled. Over 300 ships filled Tokyo Bay. Aircraft carriers stretched to the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines formed a ring of steel around the defeated empire. Above them, nearly 900 American aircraft darkened the sky in formation after formation, a thundering reminder of the industrial machine that had crushed Imperial Japan. What those Japanese officials saw that morning was not just military defeat. It was the visible proof of everything their own commanders had warned them about before the war began. And as the surrender documents were signed, the admirals and generals who had led Japan into this catastrophe were left to contemplate a truth they had been told but refused to believe. America's firepower was never the secret. The secret was that Japan's leaders had known about it all along and still chose to attack. This is the story of what Japanese generals and admirals said about American firepower, both before and after it was too late to matter. The warning came from a man who understood America better than almost any officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had lived in the United States for years. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He rented lodgings in the Boston area and immersed himself completely in American society. He walked the tree-lined streets of New England. He observed how ordinary Americans conducted their daily lives. Yamamoto was 35 years old when he arrived at Harvard. He had already sacrificed 2 fingers from his left hand during the Battle of Tsushima against the Russian fleet in 1905. He bore the permanent scars of naval combat on his body. But nothing in his previous experience prepared him for what he encountered in America. He learned to play poker and bridge, games that became lifelong passions. He discovered that these card games taught him crucial lessons about American psychology. Americans were aggressive risk-takers who calculated odds and played to win. They refused to accept defeat gracefully. They studied their opponents and exploited every weakness. These were not the characteristics of a soft, decadent people. He concentrated on understanding the oil industry, recognizing that petroleum would be the essential resource of modern warfare. Ships ran on oil. Aircraft ran on oil. Tanks ran on oil. A navy without fuel was no navy at all. And America possessed more oil than Yamamoto could have imagined. The young Japanese officer arrived in America expecting to learn about military capabilities. What he discovered went far beyond weapons and warships.
Yamamoto encountered a society of abundance that seemed almost impossible to a man raised in resource-poor Japan. Where his homeland struggled with shortages of virtually everything, America enjoyed surpluses of virtually everything. 3 observations particularly shocked him during his time in the United States. First, women attended universities alongside men as equals. This was virtually unthinkable in Japan, and it suggested a society willing to mobilize its entire population for national purposes. Second, basic commodities like sugar were abundant without any rationing. Japan constantly struggled with shortages, yet America treated luxuries as everyday necessities. Third, and most critically, the factories, steel mills, and oil fields demonstrated production capacity that dwarfed anything in Asia. Yamamoto traveled extensively across America during his tour. He visited automobile factories in Detroit, watching Ford and General Motors produce vehicles on assembly lines at rates that seemed impossible. A single Ford plant manufactured more cars in 1 month than all of Japan's automobile industry produced in an entire year. He observed the oil fields in Texas, where American wells pumped more petroleum in a single month than Japan possessed in its entire strategic reserve. The vast derricks stretched across the landscape in every direction. Tank farms held millions of barrels of crude oil. Refineries processed fuel around the clock. Japan, by contrast, had almost no domestic oil production. Every drop of fuel for Japanese ships and aircraft had to be imported, mostly from the Dutch East Indies, across thousands of vulnerable sea lanes. He saw the steel mills of Pennsylvania, where blast furnaces produced more steel in a single year than all of Japanese industry combined. Pittsburgh alone manufactured more steel than the entire Japanese empire. And steel was the foundation of modern warfare. Without steel, there could be no ships, no tanks, no artillery, no aircraft. What Yamamoto witnessed fundamentally transformed his understanding of what Japan faced if it ever went to war against the United States. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, deepening his knowledge of American society and military power. He became fluent in English. He developed an appreciation for American culture that made him simultaneously respect and fear the United States. And throughout his career, he repeatedly warned his government about the danger of underestimating American industrial power. In 1940, as militarists in Tokyo pushed for war against the Western powers, Yamamoto was asked directly what would happen if Japan attacked the United States. His response became one of the most prophetic statements of the entire war. He told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that if ordered to fight, he could run wild for the first 6 months to a year against the United States and Great Britain. He would win victory upon victory, but if the war continued beyond that, he had no expectation of success. Yamamoto understood something his colleagues refused to hear. He had seen the factories. He had witnessed the raw material wealth. He knew that Japan lacked the national power for a prolonged conflict with America. As he stated bluntly to anyone who would listen, anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. But Yamamoto did not stop with economic warnings. He understood the psychological dimension of any conflict with America. When discussing what would actually be required to defeat the United States, he made a statement that revealed the hopelessness of the enterprise. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. This was not boasting. Yamamoto was making exactly the opposite point. He was telling his colleagues that nothing less than the complete conquest of America would suffice for victory. And such a conquest was obviously impossible. Japanese propagandists later took this quote out of context, presenting it as a confident prediction of triumph. American propagandists did the same, using it to portray Yamamoto as a dangerous fanatic. But Yamamoto's meaning was precisely the opposite. He was counseling against war by demonstrating its impossibility. Despite his warnings, Yamamoto remained a loyal officer. When the decision for war was made against his advice, he devoted his considerable intellect to giving Japan its best chance of success. He designed the attack on Pearl Harbor specifically to neutralize the American Pacific Fleet and buy Japan time to establish a defensive perimeter.
If Japan could not win a long war, perhaps it could win a short one. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers and struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Over 350 aircraft descended on the harbor beginning at 7:55 in the morning local time. 18 American ships were sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships. The USS Arizona exploded catastrophically when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, killing over 1,100 sailors in seconds. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans died that morning. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers, celebrating what appeared to be a stunning victory.
But Yamamoto was not celebrating. When news of the successful attack reached him aboard his flagship, he was subdued. He recognized what others did not. The American aircraft carriers had not been in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had all escaped destruction. The attack had sunk old battleships, but missed the ships that would actually decide the Pacific War. And, most importantly, the attack had united a divided American nation in fury. Yamamoto understood American psychology. He knew that a sneak attack would enrage the American public in ways that the militarists in Tokyo could not comprehend. Before December 7th, Americans had been deeply divided about entering the war. After December 7th, they were united in a way that Japan's leaders had thought impossible. The 6 months began. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with speed that shocked the world. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Singapore, supposedly the strongest fortress in the British Empire, capitulated on February 15, 1942. The rising sun flag flew over territories containing 400 million people and the resources, particularly oil, that Japan had gone to war to obtain. Japanese newspapers celebrated. Military leaders basked in glory. But Yamamoto counted the days. He knew his 6 months were ticking away, and he knew that somewhere across the Pacific, American factories were already beginning to turn. The turning point came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, just as Yamamoto had predicted. On June 4, 1942, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed near Midway Atoll. Yamamoto had planned this battle as the decisive engagement that would destroy American carrier power. He brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. He brought 11 battleships and over 250 aircraft. It was the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled for a single operation. The Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that Japanese intelligence believed she would be out of action for months. Under normal circumstances, repairs would have taken 90 days. But American repair crews at Pearl Harbor demonstrated exactly the industrial capability that Yamamoto had warned about. Working around the clock in 3 shifts, they patched Yorktown's flight deck, restored her essential systems, and sent her back to sea after just 72 hours in dry dock. It was an impossible feat of engineering and determination, and it would prove decisive. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications and knew the attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of the atoll and waited. In 5 devastating minutes, American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline pumped through hoses. Bombs and torpedoes stacked near planes waiting to be loaded. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were reduced to burning wrecks.
The fourth carrier, Hiryu, was caught later that afternoon. She burned through the night and was scuttled the next morning. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of its most experienced pilots. Yamamoto received the news aboard his flagship. According to officers who witnessed his reaction, he was not surprised. He had predicted 6 months of victory. Midway came 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy had been fulfilled to the day. The next phase of the war revealed exactly what Yamamoto had warned about. While Japan struggled to replace its lost carriers and pilots, American industry was just beginning to hit its stride. Before the war, Japan had 6 large fleet carriers. After Midway, it had 2. Japanese shipyards began construction on new carriers, but their industrial base was fundamentally limited. Each new carrier took years to complete. The United States had 7 fleet carriers when the war began. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new carrier every month. By 1944, the Pacific Fleet had more than 20 fleet and light carriers, with dozens more under construction. The Essex-class carriers exemplified American industrial power. These ships displaced over 27,000 tons and carried approximately 90 aircraft each. They were superior in every way to Japanese carriers, faster, better armored, carrying more aircraft. Before the war, such a ship would have taken 3 to 4 years to build. American shipyards operating around the clock reduced construction time to as little as 14 months. The rate of destroyer construction was equally astonishing. At one point in 1943, American shipyards were launching a new destroyer every 4 days. Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that carried supplies across the Pacific, were built even faster. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes as a demonstration of what American industry could achieve. Over 2,700 Liberty ships were built during the war. Japanese pilots who had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor found themselves facing endless waves of new American aircraft. The Zero fighter that had terrorized Allied airmen in 1941 was designed for lightness and maneuverability. It could outclimb and outturn almost any opponent, but it achieved this agility by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits would send a Zero down in flames.
American designers took a different approach. The Grumman F-6H Hellcat was heavier and less maneuverable, but it was faster in level flight and protected its pilot with armor plate. Its fuel tanks were surrounded by self-sealing rubber that could absorb battle damage. American tactics emphasized these strengths. Hellcat pilots were taught never to dogfight with Zeros at low speed. Instead, they used superior speed and dive performance to make slashing attacks. The tactics were devastatingly effective. But it was not just quality that overwhelmed Japan. It was quantity on a scale that defied comprehension. The United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft during World War II. Japan produced approximately 70,000. American factories churned out 5 combat aircraft for every one that Japan built. The disparity extended to every category of military equipment. American shipyards produced over 150 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan produced 18. American factories produced 88,000 tanks. Japan produced fewer than 5,000. Emperor Hirohito himself began to notice the disparity. In late 1942, as the battle for Guadalcanal raged, Hirohito questioned his military chiefs about why American forces seemed so much better equipped. He asked about reports that Americans completed airfield construction in days, while Japanese engineers required over a month.
His officers explained that Americans used machines to accomplish tasks that Japanese forces performed by hand. The emperor reportedly fell silent. He understood what this meant. Japan was fighting a war of manpower against a nation of machines. The battle for Guadalcanal became a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not win. For 6 months, Japanese forces tried to retake the island. Japanese destroyers raced down the slot at night, delivering troops and supplies. Japanese soldiers attacked Henderson Field repeatedly, charging into American machine gun fire with determination and courage. Each attack failed against firepower that seemed inexhaustible. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal suffered terribly. Cut off from adequate supply, they began to starve. They ate grass, roots, and insects. Tropical diseases killed thousands. By February 1943, Japan evacuated its surviving forces. Of the 36,000 Japanese troops committed to the campaign, over 20,000 were dead, most from disease and starvation rather than combat. The pattern established at Guadalcanal would repeat across the Pacific for the next 2.5 years. Japan would defend an island with determination and courage. American forces would assault with overwhelming firepower. Japanese defenders would inflict casualties, but ultimately be annihilated. And then the Americans would advance to the next island, bringing more ships, more planes, more men, and more equipment than before. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of naval air power. Japan assembled 9 carriers with over 500 aircraft for what was supposed to be the decisive battle. Instead, they encountered Task Force 58, the most powerful naval force in history up to that point. 15 American carriers launched over 900 aircraft. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters, guided by radar, tore through Japanese formations. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were shot down on June 19th alone. American losses were approximately 30 aircraft. When the battle ended, Japan had lost 3 carriers and over 600 aircraft. More critically, Japan lost most of its remaining trained naval aviators. The men who died over the Philippine Sea could never be replaced. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 brought the war home to Japanese leaders. Saipan's capture meant that American B-29 bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. Tokyo itself would be within range of American air attacks. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led the war resigned in disgrace. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the conqueror of Singapore, was transferred to command the defense of the Philippines. He understood perfectly what he faced. After the war, Yamashita was tried in Manila. The proceedings revealed the impossible situation he had confronted. American attacks had destroyed his communications networks. He could not coordinate his scattered forces. The American forces, by contrast, possessed unlimited resources. They could bombard Japanese positions for hours before attacking. They could call in airstrikes at will. They could bring up tanks, artillery, and fresh infantry whenever needed. Japanese soldiers who survived American assaults described walls of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. The final year of the war brought suffering to Japan on a scale that even Yamamoto had not imagined. American B-29 bombers began systematic attacks on Japanese cities in November 1944. In March 1945, the strategy changed to low-altitude incendiary raids. On the night of March 9th and 10th, over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, and it was just the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers burned city after city. Japan's industrial capacity collapsed. By summer 1945, American bombers had run out of major cities to burn. The Japanese response was kamikaze attacks. Thousands of young Japanese men volunteered to die, flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions against the American fleet. The attacks caused significant casualties. At Okinawa, suicide planes sank 26 American ships and damaged over 200 more. But they could not change the outcome. For every kamikaze pilot who reached his target, more were shot down, and the flow of American ships seemed endless. Japanese commanders who survived the war described their astonishment at American resilience. Ships that would have crippled any other navy were repaired and returned to combat within weeks. Losses that would have forced other nations to negotiate were absorbed without hesitation. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave, until there was nothing left to defend. Then came the final demonstration of American industrial and scientific power. Since 1942, the United States had been working on a secret project codenamed Manhattan. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers labored at sites across the country. They were building the most destructive weapon in human history. Japan had no equivalent. The atomic bomb project cost approximately $2 billion. It employed over 125,000 people at its peak. It represented an industrial and scientific effort that no other nation on Earth could have mounted during wartime. On August 6th, a single B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach approximately 140,000. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. These weapons represented something unprecedented in human history: the ability to destroy an entire city with a single bomb carried by a single aircraft. And the fact that America possessed them while Japan did not illustrated the ultimate disparity between the two nations. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally to end the war. On August 15, 1945, his recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, the formal surrender was signed. Around the Missouri, those 300 ships and 900 aircraft displayed the power that had destroyed the Japanese Empire. It was a visual demonstration of everything Yamamoto had predicted and his colleagues had refused to believe. In the years after the war, surviving Japanese commanders were interrogated by American officers. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was among those questioned. Fuchida told his interrogators that Japan had never had a realistic chance of winning. When asked about American firepower, Fuchida described the shock Japanese pilots felt as the war progressed. In 1941, Japanese aircraft and pilots were superior to anything the Americans could field. But by 1943, American aircraft were better designed and more heavily armed. By 1944, American pilots were far more numerous and increasingly experienced. The Japanese pilots who had dominated the early battles were dead. Their replacements were novices who could not match American training because Japan lacked the fuel and time to train them properly. Other Japanese officers spoke of despair as American production overwhelmed their defenses. One naval officer described watching American destroyers expend more shells in a single bombardment than Japanese ships received in a year of resupply. An Army general spoke of ordering attacks against American positions that possessed more artillery than Japan had in its entire army. He watched American firepower reduce his defensive positions to rubble before the infantry even advanced. The fundamental truth that emerged from these interrogations was simple and stark. Japan had attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, 3 times its population, and vastly greater natural resources.
Japanese planners had hoped for a short war ending in negotiated peace. They assumed Americans would be unwilling to pay the cost of retaking distant Pacific islands. They got a long war, ending in total destruction. Yamamoto never saw the final defeat. In April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel itinerary. A flight of P-38 Lightning fighters was dispatched to intercept his aircraft over Bougainville. The mission succeeded. Yamamoto's plane was shot down, and the admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor was killed. His death came less than 18 months after the attack that was supposed to win the war. In that brief time, all of his predictions had been confirmed. The 6 months of victory were followed by grinding defeat. American industrial power crushed Japanese expansion. The sleeping giant had awakened. The tragedy of the Pacific War was not that Japan underestimated America. The tragedy was that Japan's most respected naval strategist told his government exactly what would happen, and they attacked anyway. Yamamoto warned about Detroit's factories and Texas oil fields. His colleagues dismissed his concerns as excessive caution. Yamamoto predicted 6 months of victory, followed by defeat. His colleagues assumed that American decadence would prevent sustained resistance. Yamamoto said that Japan would have to march to Washington to win. His colleagues believed that capturing a few islands would force negotiation. They were wrong about everything. And millions of people, Japanese, American, and others across Asia and the Pacific, paid the price for their willful blindness. There is a lesson in Yamamoto's story that extends beyond World War II. Expertise and accurate prediction mean nothing if leaders refuse to listen. Yamamoto possessed better knowledge of American capabilities than any other senior Japanese officer. He provided precise, accurate warnings about what would happen if Japan attacked the United States, and his warnings were ignored because they were politically inconvenient. The militarists who drove Japan to war believed what they wanted to believe. They convinced themselves that American luxury had made Americans soft. They trusted in divine destiny and dismissed material factors as secondary. The wreckage of their empire spread across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, proved them catastrophically wrong. As those Japanese officials stood on the Missouri that September morning, they could see the truth surrounding them in steel and fire. Over 300 ships, nearly 900 aircraft, the industrial might that Yamamoto had witnessed in Detroit and Texas transformed into the military power that had crushed everything Japan threw against it. Admiral Yamamoto had given them the answer years before anyone asked the question. He had stood in American factories and seen the future. He had warned his nation and been ignored. And in the end, his prediction proved perfect. Japan had run wild for 6 months. And then, the awakened giant had responded with firepower beyond anything the world had ever seen. If you found this account of Japanese perspectives on American firepower valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you accurate historical content based on verified sources and documented testimony. Share this video with others who appreciate understanding history from multiple perspectives. Leave a comment telling us which aspect of the Pacific War you would like us to explore next.
Your support allows us to continue producing educational content that brings important historical lessons to new audiences.